"I want my painting to look as if it's been programmed. I want to hide the record of my hand," said the legendary pop artist Roy Lichtenstein. But behind the perfectly rendered finished work, there was a very different story. A story of an artist working in studio spaces certainly filled with careful systems for reproduction, mechanical repetition, and deliberate process, but also spaces that facilitated spontaneity, creative mistakes, constant iteration, and a creative process that was intensely organic and human. Over the course of his career, Roy Lichtenstein worked from 18 different studio spaces, starting from very modest beginnings in a bedroom corner to eventually the expansive studio space on Washington Street in New York's Greenwich Village, a huge 3-story brick building originally used as an industrial-scale metalworking shop. Between 1987 and Roy's death in 1997, it served as a home, a studio, and a base of operations for his growing number of public commissions. 2 decades earlier, Ron had settled into a very different, but in many ways very similar kind of studio in Southampton, New York. Today, of course, it's known for its luxury homes and wealthy residents, but Lichtenstein's interest in the area wasn't about luxury or leisure. It was much more about the quiet isolation from the New York City chaos, perfect for the deep and uninterrupted painting sessions he loved so much. Dorothy, his wife at the time, said Roy loved it because there was literally nothing to do but work. And the studio itself was positioned across the lawn away from the main house, with a small and simple layout providing an efficient and focused solitude, and perfectly suited for Roy's often large painting work with high ceilings, wide open floor spaces, and large windows and skylights. The studio was divided into 2 main areas. One side with the taller ceilings was used for painting, with a cleaning sink, shelves for equipment, and his signature wall-mounted easels that were an essential and integral part of his studio setup and creative process. We'll come into more details about that in just a minute. The other side of the studio functioned as an office and storage area for both finished work and regularly used materials. The Washington Street studio had much of the same equipment and organisation, even though its size, its architecture, and the surrounding environment were very different. The main studio room was located at the back on the ground floor with around 5,000 square feet of space and 16 feet high ceilings. When Roy bought the property, he hired an architect to install the 2 large skylights and removed the long row of original cast iron columns that ran down the centre, replacing them with the large horizontal support beams you can see here, which of course significantly opened up and widened the available floor space in the studio. The front of the building was a living area with a 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor, and the 2 eyebrow-shaped skylights and the roof garden you can see in these images were actually installed as part of a big renovation project sometime after Lichtenstein's death. Roy did also own the adjacent building, 747 Washington Street, using it primarily for private storage of his larger artwork. The building's proximity to the main studio made it, of course, the perfect place for longer term storage and easy management and distribution of his work away from the primary studio space. Roy Lichtenstein certainly had some quite careful and methodical organisation in his studios, and most of the supplies and materials were identical across both locations. In the Southampton studio, all of the vertical and horizontal storage of materials and canvases were located at the back of the studio in the office area. In his New York City studio, he had a much more comprehensive series of flat file storage or plan chests in one corner of the studio, with one of the plan chests being exclusively used to store his signature Bend-Aid dots and striped pattern materials, all of which of course were handmade and used throughout his process. During a painting session, he would often tape pieces of the dots or stripes directly onto the canvas, either as placeholders or guides, sometimes just small scraps, and other times it was carefully cut shapes. The finished work was always painted, of course, but these temporary materials functioned as important planning tools, not only to test composition, the scale and colour before finalising the image, but to stay within the standardised visual language that he used across all of his work and studios. And it's important to note that this seemingly rigid system actually provided a container or clear boundary for Roy to experiment and iterate. He would often alternate between painting and adjusting until the image felt right. He would paint something and then check it with his sheets of stripes or dots, and then he would paint again and then check it again with the materials. So despite the seemingly mechanical, repetitive and highly refined appearance of the finished work, there was this very iterative and organic process going on behind it, and his organisation and studio setup very much facilitated that process. In this photo, we can see a number of quite large storage cabinets on one side of the main studio room. After Roy's death in 1997, when the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation began using the building as its headquarters, the needs of the space shifted from creating art to documentation. The foundation staff was tasked with organising Lichtenstein's archives and preparing a very comprehensive catalogue of his work, as well as thousands of photographs, catalogues, books, magazines, and other various documents. And we can see one of the boxes on the left there is labelled Lichtenstein Sketchbooks. And so to accommodate this big archival process, the foundation reconfigured parts of the studio room into an office and storage space. But these were not actually used by Roy or part of his original studio setup. One of the most characteristic and unique features about pretty much all of Roy's studios, both big and small, were the inbuilt vertical easels mounted onto the perimeter walls, essentially a system of vertical wooden slats and rails. The custom-built frame had a fairly simple dowel mechanism that allowed him to mount very large canvases and adjust the height of the easel arms, quite possibly with the canvas still mounted. They also enabled him to easily view and work on multiple paintings or a series of paintings at the same time. So this wall-mounted structure really provided quite a lot of flexibility and customization. In addition to the wall-mounted easels, another distinctive feature of his studios were the use of more traditional but also custom-designed freestanding easels that could be rotated 360 degrees and also moved around on wheels. Roy had around 8 of these easels in various locations, and you can see his detailed engineering drawings really showing how he was very intentional and specific about this particular bit of equipment. As you've probably guessed, it allowed him to rotate the canvases around and work from any orientation, which was invaluable given the size and precision of his paintings. If you've ever tried to draw or paint super straight or sharp lines, you'll know that it's much easier to do with your body and hand in a certain position. And so the rotating easel allowed Roy to paint his characteristically sharp and precise lines and dots at whichever angle was most natural for his hand and posture. Another quite distinctive but consistent feature in all of Roy's studios was the cleaning station, often positioned directly next to the shelves holding his paint cans and pre-mixed colours. You might have noticed that Roy didn't actually work with a traditional paint palette next to his canvas, as many other artists do. His colour schemes were often not only very simple, but also very systemised. So Roy had his own system of colours that was consistent throughout much of his work and standardised for all of his studio spaces. So he would mix a single colour at this paint station, ensuring that it matched his colour system, and then he would take that single colour mix over to the canvas to paint. The shelves of custom paint jars are pre-mixed colours to ensure colour consistency across a single painting or a series of paintings. And what you see on the shelving is, I'm assuming, just leftover paint or ongoing colours from that process. Roy used a variety of different oil and acrylic paint formulations throughout his career and even throughout an individual painting, but he did have a strong preference for something called Magna Paint, a special type of acrylic paint that created this very smooth, matte commercial finish that he always preferred. When Magna went out of production in the 1990s, he actually collaborated with Golden, a very well-known modern paint brand, to create a similarly formulated mineral spirit acrylic paint, or MSA, which you can see written on many of the paint jar labels. Despite the clean and meticulous quality to Roy's painting process and the often strict working schedule, Roy wasn't a robot or a machine. There was a passion and excitement for being in the studio, and both his Southampton and Washington Street studios had a warm, homey, lived-in quality. His wife said that he worked all the time and never wanted to leave, partly because he loved his work, but also because of the comfortable studio setup. There were often lots of real plants around the studio, and many of the walls were dotted with inspiration and sketches, but also photographs and personal notes. And both spaces had comfortable chairs and sofas to relax on, but also to observe and contemplate his art, something that I've spoken about in previous videos. The sofas were always positioned towards the painting area to not only provide him a comfortable place to sit, but also to provide him with the physical and mental space to sit back and observe his work. There's quite a few other interesting bits of equipment in Roy's studios, one being the large 6 or 7 foot mirror that he would use to view his paintings from a mirrored or flipped perspective, something that is a fairly common practice among artists, particularly concept artists who are trying to create a sense of realism, but they also work just as well with Lichtenstein's graphic work. It's an extremely effective way of very quickly identifying compositional imbalances in an image. So Roy would be constantly checking his work through the mirror and making necessary changes throughout the whole process. Again, really highlighting his very iterative approach to perfecting his work. Another very important and final component of Roy's studio setup was the use of large movable tables that could be rearranged or repositioned wherever needed. It's certainly not a unique studio feature, of course. It's very common for many artists to have tables in their studios, but they played a particularly important part in Roy's process, giving him plenty of table space for viewing, selecting and splicing his dot and stripe pattern materials. And you can see the green cutting mat on top of many of the tables. His process didn't just involve painting on a canvas. That was just the clean end result of sketching, cutting and collaging ideas over many messy and unstructured iterations. These tables were actively involved in his process from beginning to end, and not simply just a means of storage or organisation. It's also interesting to observe how their scratched and paint splattered appearance was in stark contrast to the clean, smooth, finished work of his canvas paintings. These work tables provided Roy with the freedom to be messy and to experiment without much thought for precision or finish. Whilst Roy certainly wanted his paintings to be precise and mechanically rendered, his studios and his equipment tell a different story. Behind every clean edge and perfectly circular dot was a studio alive with character, with warmth, with creative experimentation, and a quiet but human obsession. If you guys know any other artists that I should check out and possibly do a studio review for, let me know in the comments. I do read every single comment, so let me know your thoughts. Hopefully you found something interesting or enjoyable. If you want to see more of these kinds of videos, consider liking the video. If you really like the video, consider subscribing, because I've got some pretty cool videos planned for the future. But until next time, thanks for watching.